Hey, there we go. Um, let's start with a little bit of a market update. There was a pretty good webinar this morning with some of the top brokers from the local area. And, just so you're a tool, a great deal of instruction available between Anthony and Eric. This is a time for you to be worried about your database and working with your database and trying to get your database loaded and have a series of smart plans and neighborhood nurtures that you can set up for your database. I don't know how many were on the shift workshop a week or so ago, and they had Gary Keller on. Gary's message was the same. It's, my job every day is not to figure out who to list or who to sell to or who to represent as a buyer. My job every day is to put people into my database and develop relationships with them. And we have the tools to do that. And really, that's kind of priority number one. If you haven't loaded your database, certainly we have a number of tools to help you do that, whether it's from your iPhone or from a past, from your Outlook. If you use Outlook email, there's a lot of sources for your database. And you can then, when you put them in, you can categorize them. Are these past customers? Are these people that you know? Are these friends? And certainly you can start to take a look at how you want to touch them, how often you want to touch them. And you always want to connect them with your app, right? You have your iPhone, you can always send a real nice note out to them or call them and connect them to your app so that when they're searching properties, you'll get updates. If you know their home address, you can set them up with a neighborhood nurture, which can show them what's going on in real estate in their area. You can also set them up with a search if they're interested in some part of Naples that you know of. You can set them up with a search, so it'll give them regular updates. I send out a monthly graphs for what's going on in the market and what the sales are. You can certainly touch them with that. If you know a birthday, if you know the name of their children and their birthdays, all kinds of different ways you can reach out and touch people without saying, hey, when are you ready to buy or sell real estate? What we want to do is we want to develop a relationship with them. And then based on that relationship, if you have enough people in your database, we said that 10% of your database would be involved in a real estate transaction each year. That number's dropped to 6% because people are staying in their homes longer. And so if you have 100 people in your database, chances are that 6 of them are candidates for doing a real estate transaction. Also, we have some great tools for you to send out to ask them if they want to know how much equity is in their home. An equity analysis is a great tool. And we have a number of different ways you can do that. There's some smart plans out there that ask people about that, but most people in today's market don't know how much equity that's in their house. And it certainly is not it's a very warm call to call somebody and let them know how much, according to the various methods we have, how much is their home worth. You can use Remine. I think we've done a class on that. You can use RPR, but maybe we'll do a little bit of that today so you can kind of see where all that goes. But the bottom line is, today is the day that you need to commit to working with your database and sending out messages to them and calling them. We have the DBD2, where you pick out 2 letters of the alphabet in your database every week and call them or reach out to them in some way. So I'm going to continue to hopefully reinforce this message because, sales in Collier County last month, 40%. So we know that that's comparing February this month of February last year. Overall sales down 40%. Single family homes down 26%. And condos down 51%. So we know that the number of listings coming into the system is not, it's down 15% over last year. And the number of sales down 40%, Collier County. Lee County, a little bit better picture, but you should know that our forecast is that we will not have as many sales in 2022 as we had in 2021. 2021 was one of the best real estate years ever recorded. So we really need to focus on the things we can control, and what we can control is our database. So hopefully you're taking advantage of some of the tools I know Anthony teaches, I know Eric teaches. I know you can reach out to either of them individually if you're struggling getting your contacts in or getting a communication path set up with them. But I think that's something that you really should consider because the market, while the prices are going up and the people that are selling are realizing a great deal of equity, there's just not as many of them, and there's still a substantial demand in Naples and Lee County and Collier County, but we don't have as many units to go around. So that's kind of my broker update for the day. I just hope that you'll take advantage of what we have for you and all of the things and all the technologies we have that can help you develop business. Let's start with a share of a screen that I think is really important to you that you can get from your contract library. And can everybody see that okay? I'm gonna shrink it a little bit. Okay, so everybody says, well, now I got it under contract. What do I do now? Well, this is a real nice handy reference of all of the steps that are involved. This is based on a NABOR contract, but you can do this easily for a FAR bar. The line numbers don't match up, but this is a timeline that will really help you to understand all of the things that go from contract to close. Which we the first thing you want to do when you get a property under contract, the buyer or seller, is to take a list. Start with the very start the glossary here. There's listing license, seller. Here's one calendar of events for each contract. Excuse me. And you want to put the date in there, and you want to share this with your customer. What will that do for you? Well, A, it will keep you on track so you make sure that nothing gets missed. Obviously, not everything applies on here. Condo fire sprinkler retrofit probably isn't a big one, but the deposit dates, the condominium document delivery, when the 3 days expire, additional deposits, loan application, buyer application for association approval. Really, that's one of the key items that you need to be looking at in working with your customer. If you're working with the buyer, some of these condos are requiring 20 days or more to approve an application for the buyer. So usually to try to get that as quickly as you can get that by calling the property management. Maybe the listing agent uploaded it with the listing, which is recommended, but not always done. So you want to get that started as soon as possible. There's credit checks, there's references, there's time to go to the board of the HOA or the condo association for approval. So you really want to be on top of that and get that started as soon as possible. Usually there's a couple of different checks the buyer will have to write, one for the credit check, another for the processing by the association. So make sure you get that going as soon as you can. Seller title, you want to try to get the title policy and the survey from the seller as soon as you can, get that started with your closing agent. Obviously, the buyer's inspection period, most of them aren't going to 15 days. So if they're only 10 or they're only 7, understand that that's in the normal NABOR contract, you get your days to inspect, you then get 5 days after that to request your repairs, and the buyer's right to terminate is 5 days. So those dates are very important, especially if you submit a request for defective items and you ask for a credit or repair, and the seller sends you back something that's not acceptable to the buyer, either a credit that is well below what they asked for, or refusing to address a defective item. The buyer has that little window of 5 days after receiving the response from the seller to decide, hey, this isn't working for me. I'm going to cancel. So people say that in a normal contract, the buyer can't get out. Not true. The buyer can get out if the seller doesn't refuse to, or the seller doesn't cooperate by addressing defective inspection items. Okay. Buyer's titling instructions. NABOR contracts are assignable. So if the buyer decides they want to take title in an LLC or a trust, they have the right to do that up to 15 days before closing. Buyer has a chance to review the survey to see if there's any survey exceptions. This is all flowing right down the line till you hit closing. Buyer's walkthrough inspection, I think we've talked about that a lot of different times. One of the most important days in the contract for the buyer can be done the day before or the day of closing, or depending upon the buyer's schedule, a few days before closing. But that's the buyer's chance to make sure that all the repairs are done, that any items that are going to be left at closing, furniture, fixtures, are there, and that the place is in reasonable condition. It's not, you don't open the garage and have it look like a tornado went through there. The seller has an obligation to deliver the property in broom swept condition to the buyer, and that's your buyer's chance to verify that. And again, we've talked about it many times, but it's really important that you not be the representative for the buyer, because we have so many people that are, buying maybe a vacation home, or they're not planning on occupying right away. They may call you and say, hey, Jeff, why don't you do the walkthrough for me? I'm not going to be there. I'm tied up here at home. Your answer should be, my broker would kill me if I did that. No, just kidding. You would say, my broker really doesn't allow me to do that because I'm not covered by insurance and I'm not able to take on that responsibility. But you could bring the inspector that did the inspection along for a small charge, or you could have a neighbor or anybody else that could represent you, but I can't, because that's too much liability for me. And if I miss something, or I've had cases where they swap the beautiful Samsung washer and dryer for a Sears scratch and dent, and you don't notice it, you could be headed to Best Buy. So you don't want to do that. You want to take on that kind of responsibility. So that's a timeline that I recommend you keep in your library. I recommend you put a little calendar together, or put the dates on there and go over them with your buyer or seller, so there's no doubt that any of these deadlines are going to get missed. And really missing a deadline, I'm working with one now where the buyer's agent didn't properly notify the seller of their loan approval, it's a FAR contract, and therefore the buyer wanted to cancel. Or excuse me, the seller wanted to cancel, and the buyer said, "Oh, you can't do that." Really? Well, you missed the date, and you didn't follow along with what the contract was saying. So, you can really put your buyer or seller in a lot of trouble by missing any of these dates. Any questions on this? I mean, it's a nice little checklist. It's something that I used to use on every contract I did, and I share that with my buyer seller, and then, pretty good. That's a pretty good credibility thing for you that you got this under control. If you're using a transaction coordinator, they can help you with this, reminding you and your customer of the dates. But this is a great little tool and one that should help you a great deal. Everybody good with that? So last week we talked quite a bit about the listing contract. So this week we're going to go through the sales contract and try to hit some of the key points in the sales contract. Everybody okay with that? All right, let me get this larger and over the page a little bit. Everybody see that okay? Just give me a thumbs up. Okay. All right. So this is going to be a regular contract. If you take enough classes from Broker Jeff, you'll realize that Broker Jeff's not a huge fan of as-is contracts. But before we leave today, I want to make sure to give you some wording if you're going to do an as-is contract that can protect you from open and expired permits. So we'll make sure to hit that before we sign off today. So we went through a lot of extensive verification last week with the property appraiser's office to make sure we know who the seller is. If you're representing the buyer, you know who the buyer is. It's a great idea for you to get the personal information from your buyer as you're working with them, get their email addresses, get their cell phones, and find out how they plan to take ownership of the property. In other words, before you just put them in there as buyers, ask them the question, how do you plan to take ownership of the property? Because it could be a trust, could be an LLC, and they have those plans already. So it's a great idea for you to know that before you write the contract. So, by the way, I'm monitoring the chat. If you have a question, just or put your hand up and I'll try to call on you, and we can maybe answer any questions you have as we're going through this. So now we know if you're representing the buyer, you want to know the buyer's contact information, email addresses for the e-signing of the contract, if there's going to be e-signing. Then the seller, again, just because there's one seller showing in MLS doesn't mean that you need to accept that. You very much want to go into the property appraiser's office as we did last week. I guess we can do that real quick. Let's do there we go. All right, let's go find a listing here real quick. All right. I did that. Okay, let's go back here. I'm back. So I just picked a listing off the MLS and so you can go in, search it. You go to collierappraiser.com. Let's search the internet here and let's pick out a listing, all right? So what you want to do, can everybody see this okay? Raise your hand, can? Yes? Okay. So I just picked out a listing here. It's a condominium. We learn a lot, whether we can learn a lot from the MLS listing sheet. We can also go to the property appraiser's office, which I recommend because that tells you about the ownership of the property. And it tells you you're gathering data here. It's a condominium, so we know we have condo docs involved. And we know that there are two owners of this property, looks like husband and wife. And then we can always go and look at the deed. Okay, so the deed to the property is going to tell you who the owners are. You can always look at the deed. We actually have a little space in Command when you upload your docs. But this will always tell you George Kavanaugh and Tara Kavanaugh, husband and wife. So now we know exactly who owns the property. And they could have just had the name Kavanaugh in MLS. You don't often always know who's who the owner is. So this is the ownership, and you can go into the property detail. In this particular case, it just basically has condominium, but it shows a square footage, which is important to make sure no issued. Recently, you can see them over here, all right? Okay. So now we know the owner of the problem that. There we go, we're back. Okay, so if there are multiple owners of the property, they all have to sign the sales contract. So this is if there was more than two owners, it could, or there could be an estate, could be a trust. You have to make sure that all of the people involved in the property sign the sales contract. Notice when we talked last week about the listing contract, you did not always have to have everybody to sign the listing contract, but so noted that the person or persons that sign the listing contract are responsible for paying your brokerage commission on the sale. But in the case of the sales contract, if it's not signed by all the parties to the sales contract, it's not considered valid. So you could lose a contract by not having all the owners agree to sell the property. Lines 1 through 8 and 10 through 13 are your next step. You really want to make sure that you, if you're working with the seller, that in your listing contract, you've gone over all of this. These are mirror imaged from this listing contract as to what items might convey. And if there are things like Ring doorbells and Sonos stereo systems and things that could be considered fixtures, your Ring doorbell screwed into the wall, and your Sonos speakers may be mounted in a cabinet or on the wall, you have to make sure that the seller has given you confidence that those things are going to convey with the sale. If you're on the buyer's side and the buyer's intending to get the 60-inch plasma that's over the fireplace, then they have to make sure to add that in on line 14 there, or actually on line 8, because you can see right there in line 7, we talk about the brackets that are included, but not the TVs. So if you want the TV, put the TV in there. So as we probably talked about last week, and I talk about every time I'm talking about inventory, you know, in tennis, watching a tennis tournament, love means nothing. In real estate, as shown, furnished, turnkey, turnkey furnished, as per MLS, all of those mean nothing, nada, zero. You cannot, at the walkthrough inspection, hold the seller accountable for the word furnished, or the word as per MLS, or the word turnkey furnished, because there really isn't any way to evaluate what that means. So if there's items that are not in this paragraph here that are going to convey, then we want to say, and an inventory agreed to by buyer and seller. So there is an addendum to the contract called a personal property addendum, which says that within so many days of the contract that the buyer and seller will agree to the inventory items, or the seller, or excuse me, or the buyer can cancel. So if there are, even if the listing says turnkey furnished, and there's great pictures of all the furniture, those in themselves will not guarantee they're going to be there at closing. And believe me, one of the worst phone calls I get is from a buyer or from an agent who's representing a buyer and who said that they went into the home for the walkthrough and none of the furniture was there, and they put furnished in their listing description. And I've even argued with an attorney, although I'm not an attorney, I know a little about the contract. And the attorney assured me that he would file a lawsuit and make sure he got all of the things that were pictured in MLS. So fortunately, I know some other attorneys who were able to call and straighten this gentleman out. Because really, unless you have a detailed list signed by the buyer and seller, you have no guarantee that inventory is going to be there or has to be there when you close. So please don't shortcut this process. You can shortcut your relationship with your buyer or seller pretty quickly if this conveyance doesn't work as according to plans for everybody. Can you take a photo inventory and have everybody sign it? Sure. Can you take a video inventory? Not quite as easy to be signed and agreed to by both parties without some kind of an affidavit, but definitely you want to make sure that when you get down to line 19, you have covered what your buyer is expecting to be there and what your seller is expecting to convey with the sale. And really, literally, I can't emphasize enough that the time you spend making sure this process will go smoothly is all to do with your relationship with your customer and making sure your customer has a pleasurable, not traumatic experience. All right. So as we move down to 16, if there's something the seller specifically excludes or mentions in the MLS listing that they're going to exclude the chandelier in the foyer, which is a family heirloom, that's got to be put on line 16. The address of the property again came from the what we just looked at in the property appraiser site. The legal description of the property came there also. The legal description of the property always trumps the physical address because sometimes the post office can get a little screwy, especially out in the estates where the address doesn't necessarily show everything to do with property. Might be on a corner, might be around the corner, might not be completely the same as the full legal description. Make sure you have both of those. As we move down to the lines 24 to 26, if there's numbers on those parking spots or on the garage or a cabana or the boat dock or the storage lockers, make sure you include those, especially if you're the buyer. You want to make sure that parking spaces A101 and 102 are going to convey with the property. And, you know, the horror story is then you're selling a property in a high rise and your sellers have the two best parking spots right next to the elevator and you just put the number 2 in there, and then all of a sudden the seller runs into an old friend and they decide to swap spaces with the office, and all you put is the number 2 spaces in there. Your buyer could lose out on the best parking spot or on the correct assigned parking spots. Make sure that those are physically numbered if they have assignments. Okay, purchase price, initial deposit. In the NABOR contract, the liability to the buyer for default, meaning I don't want this house anymore, I'm gonna walk away, is deposits paid to date. So if you put a small initial deposit of, let's say, $5,000 or $10,000, and for whatever reason the buyer just absolutely decides that house isn't for them, going to work for them, and they have to walk away, that's the amount they forfeit. So then always include that on line 31 within so many days of the effective date, somewhere between 3 and 5, because you don't want to be wandering around with a check and have to, from your agent licensing that you have to have that check to your broker within 24 hours, and the broker has to deposit that within 3 days. So rather than worry about a check, put that due not later than 3 days after the effective date, then your buyer will have time to wire the money to the closing agent. All right. Your additional escrow, generally recommend that you put that additional escrow out past the end of your due diligence period. Okay. And that is when the buyer's pretty positive that everything's going to work out. They've agreed with the seller on what repairs are going to happen. So if you put that out, if your inspection is 10 days, you put that out. You have 5 days to ask the seller to repair, and then the seller has 10 days to respond. So you put that on day 26 or day 25. That would mean you would know positively whether you're moving forward before you put down that deposit. And clearly the seller will want, everybody says, how much should you put down? That's really going to be up to you in making your offer and in the seller accepting your offer. But the number 10% is out there. It certainly makes your offer credible, especially if it's a larger amount. But I would definitely stagger the deposits in the normal NABOR contract. In FAR-BAR, all deposits are at risk from day one if the buyer defaults. So there's no real benefit to staggering the deposits other than a cash flow situation. Line 34 is very important. That's the amount of the mortgage that your buyer is planning on getting. And that number is what's protected by the financing contingency, which we'll take a look at here in a minute on page 2. So make sure that that amount is what your buyer's expecting to get as a mortgage. We don't have too many seller mortgages. That's a separate animal. And I don't know, other usually might be something that might be included as part of the sale. Usually don't see too much on that. Balance of purchase price, again, is what the buyer's going to bring to the closing table after their deposits and their mortgage, if they have one. Okay. Chat. Nothing in the chat. Anybody have any questions so far? No? Okay. The top of page 2 of the contract is pretty important. I see a lot of interesting responses in this. So basically what you want to do is you want to say my offer is good until, and generally if you make it too short a period of time for the seller to review your offer, maybe they're not immediately available. So I always recommend you give them a couple days. But we talk a lot about calling the listing agent before you finalize this contract and say to the listing agent, hey, can you tell me, if you have some other offers on the property? And can you tell me, how many of them are cash and how many of them are mortgage? And one of the more important questions is to say to the listing agent, gee, is there anything in your contract that the seller would prefer that would make our offer more attractive to the seller than just an offer that comes off the street? Yeah, my sellers really would like, 45 days to vacate because they got to get all their possessions together. Maybe they need a storage unit, maybe they need to move. They would like a 45-day close. Or they would like to be able to stay in the property for 30 days after closing. So if other people are just making offers and they haven't called the listing agent to find out, and your offer comes in and maybe it's not the highest offer, but it has the best terms for the seller and the seller feels comfortable with your offer or another offer, that can be helpful to you. It's also helpful if you call the listing agent and say, do you have some other offers? And the listing agent says, yes, we have several other offers. And you say, can you share with me if any of them are over the list price of the house? And if he says half of them are over the list price and quite a list price, and your buyer is saying, well, this house needs some work, let's go in 20% below the list price, you can save your buyer a lot of aggravation right there and then. By Naples right now is 100.4%. So making an offer a lot less than that is probably not in your best interest. So that's always call the listing agent, even if it's a short conversation. It's a good conversation, and you can establish some credibility with the listing agent by saying, hey, this is Jeff Jones. I've got working with some great buyers. They're interested in your place. Can you just give me a little basic information? And many times you might discover a little trinket that sets your offer apart from another. So that period of offer is how long your offer is good for. So if I put 5 o'clock tomorrow night and the seller responds on Wednesday morning, my offer is not any good anymore. I would have to toss out an initial that date. But I get half a dozen of them every month that the period of offer had expired before the seller signed the contract. And that's not a good thing. Because if there's any kind of remorse or any disagreement between the buyer and seller, the first thing an attorney will do is look at that and say, well, you don't have a contract. That's an embarrassing moment. So make sure you keep that date. Give ask the listing agent when you're talking to them, you know, what is your seller thinking about in terms of, you know, what kind of time do they want to consider the offer? If he says, well, they're on a cruise, they won't be back for 2 days, probably not a bad idea to put 3 days out there. If he says, you know, there's multiple offers, they're going to consider everything on Saturday morning, so you can make your expiration of your offer far enough out that they can consider your offer. All right. So a counter offer is any time you submit the offer to the seller says, nope, but I will sell it for this, or I will do that. That's a counter offer. And that gives an additional 2-day period from the expiration of the original offer for the seller to respond. And if there's another counter, for the buyer to respond. So you have 2 days, unless you override that line 43. And remember the 2 little words at the top of line 41. Accepted and the signed offer delivered to offeror. So it's accepted and delivered. So just because the seller has signed it, if they haven't delivered it back to you by the expiration, same with the counter, just because the buyer has signed the counter but hasn't sent it back, it's accepted and delivered. So if for some reason the buyer takes a little bit of time to respond to a seller's counter, in the meantime, a better offer comes into the seller, and the buyer has not accepted and delivered that counter offer back to the seller. The seller can say, I've got a better offer. I'm going to rescind my counter offer. And all that has to be is in writing from the agent, the listing agent, to the buyer's agent saying, hey, the seller is rescinding their counter offer and we don't have a deal. And this is kind of a crazy time, and that prices are going up, and not that much inventory out there. So make sure you police these times and dates, and make sure if for some reason you have a deal, but it's outside of that period, that you amend that date either by changing it and initialing it, or by an amendment to the contract saying all parties agree that the period of offer is such and such to make the contract valid. All right. The other thing that's important here is dates. I see contracts that have been back and forth a couple times. There's all kinds of initials all over the place, but no dates. So what is the effective date of the contract? The last date either buyer or seller has signed or initialed. So if you're making changes on a counter offer and you don't put the date in there, and it takes 3 or 4 days to get all this done, your effective date could be 3 or 4 days earlier, because that's the last date that there was anybody's signature or initials. So I encourage you strongly to make sure your buyer or seller, when they're signing or countering an offer, that they initial it and date it, so that your effective date becomes the best possible date when there's a full agreement of all the parties to the contract. So make sure you and the effective date becomes that last initial or last signature date, And that is day zero. Let me repeat that. The effective date is day zero. The effective date is day zero. Sound like a broken record? Because most people count it as one, which is not usually a big deal, except if it puts you over an inspection period or a deadline in the contract that we went over with all the timelines. So make sure you understand that the effective date is day zero. The day after that is day one. We count calendar days, except when the ending date ends on a weekend or federal holiday, or the observance of a federal holiday. So the end of the inspection period, let's say the deposit's due in 3 days. The contract becomes effective on Wednesday, which is day zero. So 3 days, Thursday, Friday, Saturday is the due date, but it is a weekend or federal holiday. It bumps to Monday at midnight. So it's calendar days and counting these intervals, with the exception of can't end on a weekend or federal holiday. I keep looking in the chat. I don't see anything. I'll keep going. The closing date, let's talk a little bit about time of the essence. Time of the essence means that if that date comes and goes without an event occurring, that the party that it does not perform by that date is in default. The only time of the essence in this contract is the closing date. In the FAR bar, all dates are time of the essence. So this is a much more forgiving contract in that if you miss a deposit by 1 day, you can always make amends. If you miss a deposit by 1 day in the FAR bar contract, you're in default. So the closing date is time of the essence. If it's not going to be met, it needs to be extended, or the party that doesn't meet their obligation, either seller or buyer, is in default, and then the default remedies apply. Method of payment. Okay, so here's your two decisions when you're talking about if the contract is cash, you check box A, cash. The contract is financing, you go down to line 57, financing contingency. So now, because of the number of contracts that people, are working with buyers and they're trying to use mortgage financing, and finally they say, look, I'm just going to go in cash. I've lost a couple other deals. You have to ask the question, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, are you able to close on this home if you don't get the loan? If they say, no, there's no way, you've got to make sure that they understand they could lose their deposit if that loan doesn't come through by the closing date. And the seller may not have any sympathy with them if they aren't able to make that date. So they could lose their deposit. It's not a great idea for a buyer to go in cash if they absolutely have to have a mortgage. It's okay for a buyer to go in cash and get a mortgage. It's okay for a buyer that has the cash to get a mortgage because they may be able to take advantage of some great rates. If they are doing that, they could check cash and still get a mortgage. However, they have no protection for their deposit if something goes wrong with the loan. The second option, obviously, is a financing contingency. And then there are some choices. Is it conventional, VA, FHA? Other could be USDA, could be hard money financing. But you need to check the box there. And the seller, that's part of accepting the offer, if there's a VA or FHA, there's an addendum that needs to be included that provides for certain rights for the buyer. In the case of the FHA, the lender will require the seller to sign some papers that are, the lender will require that the buyer to sign some papers favorable to the buyer, in that if the property doesn't appraise, the buyer does have the chance to walk away. And it's a complete walk away. So if it's FHA, that addendum needs to be supplied and needs to be explained to your seller what some of the ramifications are. If it's VA, same thing. The seller has certain responsibilities in a VA a loan, and that seller needs to be aware what they are and how they could affect the closing and what expenses that the seller might have to undertake to help the VA or FHA loan. All right. There are some fill in the blank defaults in some of these, but Broker Jeff's not a fan of blanks. If you leave it blank, did you mean that you wanted to use the default value, or did you not discuss it with your buyer when you're preparing the contract? So please try to fill in all the blanks, and there's no doubt. There's a fixed rate not exceeding, and if you leave that blank, we don't know what that is. Also, don't recommend you put, a lot of people put MKT in there for market. The market rate for a buyer with a 500 credit score and a buyer with an 800 credit score are entirely different. So if you put market in there, I don't know what that means. These are meant to protect the buyer. If they put 4% in there and they can't get a loan for 4%, that gives them a chance to exit the contract with their deposit if they're not able to get the rate that they've specified in there. Okay. Same with the term. Your buyer needs to make loan application. Hopefully they've already made loan application to get their pre-approval started. So for those of you that are working with buyers, and obviously the financing tends to weaken their offer in the eyes of the seller, there are from several lenders now what are called pre-underwriting or post-underwriting letters of approval, which can mean that if you have a post-underwriting letter from the lender, that basically means that your loan has pretty much been approved subject to any conditions that the lender might have. So it's a much stronger financed offer than the just the pre-approval, and I'm going to try to get your application and do the best I can to get you approved. So there are some techniques out there that have been introduced by the lender to make your offer a little stronger, and make sure that you as the buying agent, you know, have a decent a line of communication with the lender, or that your buyer is communicating with them regularly and communicating back to you. There's no problem in getting usually extensions and some flexibility on part of the seller if you communicate with the seller. A lot of times, you know, this is, you know, 40, you can see that on line 65 that we have a decision point in the contract where the buyer needs to waive their financing contingency. So if I have regular communication with the listing agent and the seller regarding my progress for the loan, regarding whether I have loan approval, conditional loan approval, whatever, the more I communicate, the more I'm able to stay in communication with the other side about the progress of my loan, the more chances are that the seller is going to be somewhat flexible if a date needs to be extended or whatever. The other thing is, you'll notice down here on 65, there I definitely don't recommend you let that default to 45 days, but there needs to be a date there when the buyer and the buyer's lender feel comfortable that they've been able to review the buyer's situation and issue at least a conditional loan approval. So you'll notice that after that date, and I suggest that date be at least a week or 10 days ahead of your closing so that the seller has a chance to make sure that you're going to get your loan, and before they hire a moving van or make a lot of moves to get out of the place, they'd like to have a little bit of good communication from the lender and that, hey, we're on track here. This is a good loan. We're going to be able to do fine with that. So that contingency date is pretty important. It's pretty important that you make sure the lender can live with that date. And notice that if it goes beyond that date and the buyer has not waived their contingency, that either seller or buyer may terminate this contract at any time. So what's happened is I'm 40 days in, 45 days in, and I still don't have a loan approval. And in the old days, before the inventory got so tight, the buyer would say, well, I'm not going to waive. If the seller wants to cancel, let them cancel. And from a seller's standpoint, when there were a lot of fish in the sea, the seller didn't necessarily want to cancel because they have, invested 40, 30, 45 days into the loan, and they'd like to make sure they get, it gets closed. Now, a seller may take the position, hey, I've been off the market for 30 days. I haven't heard a lot from this buyer, and they haven't waived their financing contingency that make their deposit firm by this date. I'm out of here. I'm back on the market. And I've had some sad stories where the agent and the buyer didn't focus on that date. And the buyer the seller has a backup offer, or the seller has had lots of offers and said, look, I know you're not going to waive this. That's fine. My prerogative is to move on. And that's one of the sad parts of missing a date and not having your buyer be aware of what the consequences are. So it's very important that line 65, very important date. So if the buyer decides to terminate, then they need to get a letter from the lender, which is an equal opportunity credit statement of adverse credit action. It's kind of a federal form where the lender fills it out and says, I'm denying this loan because, and it's not so easy to get a lender. In the FAR all it is an email, but in the lender statement for the NABOR contract, we feel like, hey, it's important that the lender put a serious statement together saying, I'm not going to grant this loan because, and that saves from somebody changing their mind and calling the lender and saying, hey, I want to get out of this. Can you write me? Most lenders will not sign that equal opportunity credit off unless there's truly a denial of the credit. All right. So to finish up the financing contingency part of this, there's a few things that can go wrong here, just isn't ready to close. And some of your major lenders that are busy right now, they may not be able to meet your buyer's closing date. They may start working on the package, just a couple of days before ink here, all caps. There's a facility for the buyer to say, okay, I'm going to need to delay the closing up to 10 days because my loan isn't going to be ready. So, but look at what that says. If the buyer waives the financing contingency and is unable to close on the closing date due to a delay caused solely by the creditor lender, in other words, the lender's waiting for proof tax returns or something from the buyer before they can issue the final loan approval and clear to close, then that's not a lender delay. But if it's truly a lender delay, the buyer can waive their contingency if they haven't already, exercising this right. So what where people go way off the rails here is they call over and the listing agent says, you know, you're all ready to close and everything. And the agent says, oh, we got 10 days. No worries. We'll make it within 10 days. And 10 days closing tomorrow. And they say, oh, well, the lender's not ready. So we're not gonna make sure the buyers waive their contingency and send them a notification, an email will do, that you are extending the closing date up to 10 days for the CFPB rule or for a lender delay. So that's not a automatic get out of jail free card for the buyer as far as the closing date, but it is a protection for the buyer when the lender just isn't able to get the closing package to them. And usually it's a day or two. It's not usually too long, but we do allow up to 10 days. Okay, that's pretty much the end of that paragraph. Understanding that once the buyer waives their contingency, their deposit's at risk if they don't close. That loan isn't done and ready to close on the closing date. The seller's not willing to extend. That's a problem for the buyer. All right. So CDD and Metropolitan Statistical Taxing Units are special tax districts, of which we have quite a few in the Southwest Florida area. There's actually a list of all of them in the contract library. And if your property is located in that, it should say so in the MLS, but you can all verify, you know, that it's in that district, okay? And if that's true, then the buyer is agreeing in this contract to assume the balance that's outstanding at closing. So let's take Pelican Bay or Pelican Marsh and Tiburon is all one CDD. The developer went in and put in all the amenities, roads, clubhouse, tennis court, so forth and so on. And then as each property in that development closed, a certain percentage of the cost of that community development was put back on the individual homeowner, such that over 20 years, they would pay their fair share of. So usually it's 15 to 20 years, and it's usually 20, 25,000 in that range. Varies from community to community. So that's a case where the buyer automatically assumes the capital balance. We get down here now to assessments. There's another sticky wicket. So if there are assessments for the condo or homeowners association and they have been levied already, in other words, they're already in place or will be in place by the effective date, then the seller is responsible for dealing with all of that. Now, you get let's take something like a Naples Lakes Country Club where there's probably 7 assessments. They've assessed for the golf course, one of the 9s each year. They've assessed for a new clubhouse. They've assessed for a new health workout studio. They've assessed for putting in pickleball courts. And every one of these carries a monthly assessment. And so if your buyer is coming in, they are not obligated by contract they're not obligated by contract to pay those. If you've got the seller and there's a bunch of installment assessments, it's a great idea for you to negotiate that as part of the contract. And so, I mean, I have seen cases where the listing agent doesn't inform the seller they're going to have to make all those good at closing. And that's can be a source of great angst for the seller. So make sure you understand you're on the listing side, anything to do about assessments. If you're on the buy side, you want to know if there's any assessments being considered, not yet voted on, but in being considered. So the last sentence in that paragraph basically says that the seller has the obligation to disclose to the buyer any pending upcoming assessments. So if it's not known as to the amount or when it's going to be assessed, but it's known to the seller as something that's coming, then the seller is obligated to disclose that to the buyer. Or if it exceeds 1% of the purchase price, the assessment, the buyer can terminate the contract unless the seller agrees to pay everything over 1%. Doesn't happen too often. If you've got the seller disclose, then that relieves you of that obligation. Even though we don't know the amount, we know that there's a insurance, a battle with the insurance company, there's litigation, and we know that if the settlement comes back short of what we owe, there's going to be an assessment. You need to disclose that to the potential buyer so they're aware of it. And if you've disclosed it, then that eliminates your obligation to pay everything over 1%. If there's in 93, if there's a listing or a lease, excuse me, the property's under lease or will be under lease, the buyer has the right to see those leases and make sure that they will accept them. The Landlord Tenant Act, of course, says, you can't just go in and say, oh, I'm selling the property, you're out, notice, or wait until that lease expires, or for them to take possession. So if it's an investment deal, that's great. But if the property's leased for the season, maybe through April, and the police, and they're entitled to all of the security deposits and everything that goes for that lease after they take possession. So there'll be a disclosure from the seller to the buyer. Here's the leases. Here's what they look like. Here's the money they're at. And the chance for the buyer to review them. If they're okay with them, then it moves forward. If not, the buyer can say, I don't want any part of those leases. I'm done. Okay, so we're down to the inspection paragraph here. Okay, so the buyer has choices here. The choices are they can inspect the property, and we won't get to that today, but there's property and to find defective items and ask the seller to address the defective items, either by repair or by the buyer can decide to, or as is contracted, and now the contract becomes an as is contract. Waiver. We do not recommend in any way, shape, or form that a buyer waive inspections, even though they may want to make their offer look better to the seller. Oh, I'm going to waive inspections. Therefore, the seller knows that they don't have to make any repairs or anything. They're like, they're not going to even show up. But the buyer needs to know, if I waive inspections, the only time I can go in the property is the walkthrough inspection. Now, if I've seen the property today, I write the contract, I waive everything, and I'm not going to get in the property for another 6 to 8 weeks. How do I know what happened to that property from the time I looked at it to the time I had the walkthrough? It's very difficult to tell. There is what's called a seller's maintenance obligation on every home that says the seller's obligated to maintain that property in the condition it was in at the time we went to contract. But when a buyer goes to verify that and they've waived inspections, the only chance they have is at the walkthrough inspection to make that determination and be able to prove it, and it can be somewhat difficult. So we don't recommend that you waive inspections, and we actually have a buyer notice that we will ask you to have the buyer sign if they are either going to waive inspections or they're going to go in cash and need the mortgage to close. All right. So we now get into the, what we call the boilerplate part of the contract. Again, it's a great idea because we're in a kind of a fervent buying environment where things have to happen quickly and decisions have to be made quickly. It's a great idea for you to send this copy, this contract to your buyer when you're first working with them, and at least breeze through it and talk to them about some of the things that are really important in the contract. Survey objections, but especially when you get down into disclosures. All right. So now the disclosures are basically saying to the seller, what do you know? And the seller knows of no facts or conditions materially affecting the value of the property. Especially those were readily observable by the buyer. If it's land or you're buying a home in the estates and there's wetlands on the property where you cannot build or inhabit any of that, you need to know about that. Permits and violations, seller says they don't know of any improvements to the property were made without permits or of any existing violations of local. So there's the seller certifying that they don't know of any, but if they've hired somebody to put on a new roof or to put in a new air conditioner and that permit wasn't properly closed out, the buyer still under the regular contract has the right to ask for that permit to be closed. And that's where we differ in an as-is contract. So we're getting kind of toward the end here, but I want to go through all of these disclosures. So anyhow, past insurance claims, the current cost of insurance for a buyer can materially affect their ability to get a loan. So early on, we want to find out, A, what are the seller's insurance rates? B, can we assume their policy? And C, what's it going to cost us to move into that property? And that's really something that should be done really ahead of contract signing because there's cost skyrocket. However, if that puts me in a position where I'm not going to get my loan, the financing contingency could protect me. But again, these are things that you really need to go over with your buyers and make sure they understand. So you get into lead-based paint hazards, mold, property taxes, that sort of thing. These are all disclosures to the buyer, but they're not reasons for them to get out of the contract. Then we get down into inspections. And again, we can spend a whole period on inspections. As a matter of fact, I think I did the inspection slides a couple of weeks ago, but we can spend a whole lot of time. These are not new places. Okay, it's 2:55. So the seller's maintenance obligation, I think, is where we'll try to cap it off today. Regardless of whether it's an as-is contract or a regular contract, the seller's maintenance obligation basically says that I, the seller, am obligated to maintain the property and the condition was in when we went to contract until closing, and that can be verified by the walkthrough inspection. So if I'm the seller and I'm like, well, I'm selling this place, I don't care about the landscaping, I'm just going to turn the sprinklers off. That's a seller's maintenance obligation. If you show up for your walkthrough inspection and all the foliage is dead, you have the right to ask the seller to replace that and put it back in the condition that was in when we went to contract. If you walk in and all of a sudden the pool's leaking or the air conditioning is not cooling properly, this is why we suggest that you bring your inspector back or the walkthrough, because your inspector can maybe find if there's anything that they see since their inspection that could have gone wrong. A puddle on the floor, a big moisture spot up by a window, things that really are the seller's maintenance obligation that would be noticed by, a trained eye, might be something good for you to have the inspector there during the walkthrough. And notice that the seller shall escrow a sum of 200% of the estimated cost to pay an appropriately licensed contractor to remedy the situation. And notice it says the escrow sum is not a cap on the seller's liability. So let's say there's a leak in the shower pan. And as you go through there, you notice in an adjacent closet that the drywall is wet. And that didn't show up on inspection. That didn't show up when we first looked at the place. So now the inspector's like, wow, that could be really bad. And they go in and they run the shower and they notice that there's moisture there. Now the seller has to escrow money to fix that. So let's say it's $5,000 to tear the shower out, put a new pan in and all that. So the seller really would have to escrow $10,000. 100%, yeah, $10,000. And that doesn't cap their liability, right? So this is an important thing for your buyer to understand. And it's important for them to understand why we do walkthroughs and why we use the inspector to be there to make sure that there's nothing that we're not seeing that we might inherit if we sign at the closing and we don't make sure that the sellers perform their maintenance obligation. We make sure that all of the furniture and items on our inventory are there. We make sure that if the seller needed to clean out things out of the garage or whatever, that they've done so, that the property's in inhabitable, room swept condition. And that's the bottom line right there. All right, it's 2:59. I did tell you that I would tell you one thing before we go. I'm going to stop my share. Go back here. I'm going to go out of here. All right. Yeah, I'll find it. I know I had it earlier today, so. Still finish up my class. No problem. There we go. Sorry. So it's really important. Can you see this okay? Everybody see this? Okay. You might take a picture of that or ask me to email it to you or something like that. But if we strongly suggest if you're going to write an as-is contract, be it FAR/BAR or NABOR, that you include this language in the other terms and conditions. This is attorney-approved language. And what it does is it protects your buyer from inheriting open or expired permits, municipal liens, or code violations, because the as-is contract will not protect your buyer from these conditions. You notice that we said in the NABOR contract, we said that the seller's not aware of anything. But what if the seller hired an air conditioning contractor to put in a new air conditioner, and the contractor put the air conditioner in but never closed out the permit? How would the seller know that? So just because the seller's affirming that they know of no conditions doesn't mean that they would reasonably be aware of them. So if you put this language into your other terms and conditions, you will protect yourself from a couple of situations that we've had this week where there were open permits with substantial financial implications, and or what happens if the seller is putting on a new roof and the roof isn't done. Tiles were delayed. Now the closing date's coming up, and the roof is still not completed. There was no language in there about any open permits or about, they just promised everybody the roof would be done, no problems. But now we have an open permit for a roof that can't be closed out until the tiles are all installed on the roof and the permit's closed. So now the buyer is in kind of a pickle about how are we going to close on this property. The lender won't give us our loan until they see a CO on the roof. If this language was in there, it would be all on the seller to say, I got to close that permit, so I can't close. So protect yourself. This is something that a lot of agents have asked me for, and you have it, and I'm going to circulate an email, I think, here. But if you need it, I can email it to you, or maybe you've got a screenshot of it. Okay. All right, it's 3:04. Sorry, I was a little late jumping on. I was kind of figuring out which link I was supposed to be on. I was having an identity crisis. So hopefully, does anybody have any questions? I don't see anything in the chat. Is there anything that you're struggling with or that you'd like to talk about before we sign off? No? Okay, Mr. Benson, thank you for jumping on. How you doing?
I'm doing okay. Just working on multiple offer situation.
There you go. We've got a class that we're going to do on multiple offers. I think we're going to do that sometime this month. So I know I put one together with Sam that was very popular, and I think a couple of our other agents want to jump in on it. So we're definitely going to have them.
Are some of those that you've done with Sam archived on neighbor.com?
Yes, possibly that multiple offer presentation was archived. We can check it and see. I'm not worked that NABOR archive.
Is that something we would share in the Facebook group?
I don't think it's in the Facebook group. I can send you the slides. How's that?
Yeah, I'd like to listen to what was said if it's archived. I mean, if it's recorded.
Okay. I'll shoot you the slides in the meantime, in case you can find it. Okay.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. Thanks a lot. Appreciate your patience when we jumping on. Next week, I have the link, so I won't be late. Thanks again. Have a good day.
Bye now.